Hello, I'm Gabriel from Maracaibo, Venezuela, and today I want to ask a very specific question. Will history absolve Fidel Castro? Well, as we all know, Fidel Castro is dead. During his trial in 1953, he pronounced his famous words, "History will absolve me." Whereas Donald Trump has emphatically condemned him, Obama has been more cautious and he has proclaimed that indeed the jury is still out and that history will judge Fidel Castro's enormous impact. So, will history absolve Fidel Castro? Well, Fidel pronounced those words as part of his defense in his trial. He had attacked the Moncada barracks, and I think he absolutely had the moral right to do so. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista suspended the upcoming elections and seized power in a military coup. He immediately became a dictator, suppressing many basic liberties. Ethicists have long agreed that there is a right to revolution, and I think that Castro adequately appealed to that right. He attacked a legitimate military target and he spared civilians. This is a major ethical requirement in the right of revolution. So I would say that up till that moment, Castro should have indeed been absolved by history. But that was only the beginning of a long political career. And despite some important moral achievements, I am afraid that in balance, no, Fidel Castro will not be absolved by history, and he will go down as an immoral political leader. In 1955, in an attempt to build national consensus, Batista pardoned Castro. Fidel continued with his political agitation and he was exiled to Mexico. While he was there, in a truly audacious move, he embarked on a minor fleet to Oriente region in Cuba to begin a campaign of guerrilla warfare in 1956. During the offensive, he proved to be a master of propaganda and deception. With wise tactics, he completely fooled Herbert Matthews from the New York Times, who believed that Castro's control of the Cuban countryside was much greater than what it actually was. From an ethical perspective, this is really not objectionable in itself. Just war doctrines allows deceit as well as ambushes as long as the military goals are legitimate. To topple the dictator Batista was indeed a legitimate goal. I think that overall, Castro's guerrilla warfare complied with the ethical requirements of armed conflicts. So Castro ultimately succeeded, and in 1959, Batista fled the country. Sadly, however, now in power, almost from the start of his political career, Fidel began to lose the moral ground. Once in power, he authorized a huge number of executions by firing squads. Many of those charged with crimes were probably guilty, but the trials were mostly done in kangaroo courts, so there was not a real possibility of finding out the truth, and undoubtedly, some innocents were also executed. Some of his former supporters in the guerrilla campaign in Sierra Maestra objected. Perhaps the most notorious case was that of Uber Matos, a guerrilla commander who objected to Castro's ruthlessness and resigned his post as commander. Castro did not accept his resignation and charged him with treason. Matos was summarily sentenced to 20 years of prison. According to his own testimony, Matos was tortured during his prison time. At first, Fidel promised elections, but ultimately he decided that liberal democracy was a corrupt system in itself and elections are subject to private funding and manipulations that affect the common good. He rhetorically asked, "Elections for what?" And ever since, there have been no real elections in Cuba, despite the regime's attempts to showcase some electoral activity, which in fact is as bogus as any elections carried out by communist regimes during the Cold War. He had been ethically justified to engage in guerrilla warfare and topple a dictator. But now that he became a dictator himself, I think his opponents had ethical justification to try to topple him down. For that reason, I believe that despite the obvious imperialist interests of US government, the Bay of Pigs invasion was actually moral. However, as it is well known, it was a major strategic fiasco. And as a response to the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro allowed the Soviets to install nuclear weapons in Cuba in 1961, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was also a morally dubious move. Some ethicists believe that nuclear deterrence may be moral. For instance, Reinhold Niebuhr believed this. But very few ethicists would agree that an actual nuclear first attack would be ethically authorized. We now know that during the crisis, Castro encouraged Nikita Khrushchev to launch a nuclear attack in the case of an American invasion of Cuba. Well, fortunately, Khrushchev proved to be a much more rational and ethical man than Castro. For more than half a century, Cuba was under the influence of American imperialism. The infamous Platt Amendment in Cuba's Constitution of 1902 gave the US the right to militarily intervene in Cuba at its will. So Castro deserves praise for standing up to American imperialism. But in his attempt to do so, he massively confiscated Cuban and American citizens' property who had little or nothing to do with imperialism. Now, as a response, the US imposed a trade embargo on Cuba. And as we all know, this proved to be to be a very inefficient approach. But I would not rush to morally condemn it, at least in its initial stages. Economic sanctions may be morally acceptable to put pressure on despotic regimes. For instance, they played a very big role in the demise of South Africa's apartheid. Although, of course, after 5 decades of uselessness, I think Obama was right to overturn the economic sanctions. Fidel also supported revolutionary movements abroad. Some of these movements, I believe, were ethically legitimate. Cuban engagement in the Angolan Civil War, for example, significantly weakened South Africa's regime, and that turned out to be an important factor in the demise of apartheid, which was a deeply immoral system. But there has always been an air of hypocrisy in this regard, as Castro continuously scolded Western powers for military interventions abroad, when in fact he was too eager to impose socialism with bayonets. In this, he had a disturbing resemblance to American neoconservatives who want to implant democracy in the Middle East by force of arms. Furthermore, some of the revolutionary movements that he aided were against legitimate and democratically elected government, such as those of Colombia and Venezuela. Ever since 1989, there have been allegations that Castro was involved in drug smuggling operations in connection with Pablo Escobar and Manuel Noriega from Panama. If true, this would be the greatest indictment of Castro's moral character. Such allegations have never been proven. However, Castro pursued a major purge in the Cuban armed forces in 1989 by accusing General Arnaldo Ochoa of drug trafficking. This was pretty much a Stalinist show trial where the defendant was forced to confess. The unfairness of the trial has raised suspicions that perhaps Ochoa was just a scapegoat, and Castro was indeed the mastermind of a drug smuggling operation, all in the name of the revolution, as indeed Colombia's FARC also did during the 1980s. Yes, Fidel Castro improved healthcare and education, but it came at a great price. It may very well be true that the US turned him into a dictator with a series of missteps, but I don't think that's a sufficient exoneration. History will acknowledge some of Castro's achievements, but overall, history will not absolve him.